Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, no matter what time zone you're in, for joining us for this Global Women in Real Estate event. We're very pleased that you could all be here. To start off today, I'd like to give a moment for Francois, who is the president of the International Real Estate Society, to welcome us all. And then I will introduce our featured speaker for today's seminar.
Megan, thank you very much for that. And on behalf of the entire IRIS community, great welcome to all of you. This is an initiative that was started some time ago, and we're so proud to be able to take this forward and to see so many of you at the seminar. I'm going to keep it short, but I'm also very pleased that this is happening and that there's a focus on the resilient real estate. It's a topic that, as IRIS, we have been taking to our sister societies, from the Pacific Rim Real Estate Society to the American Real Estate, European, and now we will also be taking it to the African Real Estate Society meeting next week. It's a topic that a few years ago was a minor part of any conference, and we're now seeing at many of our conferences up to 7-8 sessions dedicated to this. Also, in the broad context, Megan, as your introduction, we are here with good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're across the globe, and I think that when we look at resilience in the real estate society, there are a few issues that immediately come to play here. Yes, ESG has been used overly, and some have argued it's a concept that has been captured, and you can make it mean whatever you want to make it mean. But I think that the term resilient and sustainability is probably a stronger one that we can usefully engage with. And again, if we look at the diversities of economies that we all come from, I'm certainly one that says, let's make sure that we put S at the right spot in ESG. Sometimes it's a sort of E first, and without S, I don't think we will move very far in many economies in the context that we have. And many will argue that the environmental is a social issue at the end of the day. So it's great. I had a quick look at the speakers, the different speakers over time, and that will be presenting. And there's a nice diversity as well with the keynote speaker, of course, coming through. But I think it's quite important. I think we are at a point where, in fact, I had a discussion with a few academic friends this morning, and we were sort of pondering whether we've had any impact whatsoever over our careers. But I think if there's one issue that is getting picked up, it is certainly around resilience, sustainability issues in the private sector. So I think the way that we will be engaging in the sector is altering, and it's altering very quickly as well. So I also see the talk on housing we have, and of course we need to move into all its spheres, not to leave out green finance. I see also Karen is in here, who's done a lot of work, and others who've done a lot of work in this field. So I think a great opportunity to bring it together. Megan, I think I will stop on here, and once again to say, as the International Real Estate Society, we're very proud to be associated with this initiative, and thank you for Megan and the entire team involved for taking us to where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction to our session today. And I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Megan McCollum, and together with Yi Wu, who's also on the call, we were the co-organizers of this GWIRE committee this year. We also have several great committee members who will be leading the second half of our time together today as we explore the topic of resiliency through several different research areas of focus. So that's our agenda for today. We're going to enjoy a keynote speaker here who I'll introduce in just a moment. But after we get to hear what she has to say, I'll open up for questions. If you think of questions during the talk, please just put them in the chat, or if you think of something at the end, you're free to ask it then as well. So also, when we finish with our keynote speaker, I will open up those breakout rooms, and you are all encouraged to go. The topics for each of those will appear on your screen, and you're encouraged to join whichever one best suits your interest. Maybe it's something you're already working on. Maybe it's something you are interested in learning more about. So we have a host for each of those rooms who will lead you through a discussion of resilience in the context of that particular research area. You're free to stay in those rooms as long as you like. That will be the remainder of our time together. You are also free to change rooms at any point in time as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to begin the main event of our time together and introduce our keynote speaker. So our keynote speaker is Dr. Basirat Oyalowo. She is a lecturer at the Department of Estate Management at the University of Lagos. So she is, when we as a committee decided that this is the topic that we wanted to focus on for this year's event, several different committee members recommended her for our featured speaker. So I think we're in for a real treat today. And I would encourage you all to welcome her now. And I will turn over the screen and sharing privileges to her at this moment. Her keynote speech will be about 30 minutes, but as I said, please just go ahead and add on any comments or questions that you have throughout, and then during our Q&A session, I'll incorporate all of those into our discussion together. So thank you so much, and I will pass it over now.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Can you hear me good? Yes. Okay, so I'm trying to share my screen, and it's not allowing me to.
Try again. I just changed the settings.
Oh, great. So I'm there now. And while I'm sharing, I just want to thank the whole house and everyone for inviting me to speak at this very important event. A bit anxious to ensure that I actually make it to you. Okay, so that's the screen, right? You can see that? Great. Okay. So the topic of my discussion today is pathways towards resilient real estate from local to global. And my choice of this topic is actually intentional, and of course, looking at the way the real estate market is structured, being one that is, highly localized, so to say. So I want us to explore together the collaborative pathways to anticipating and responding to shocks and stresses that threaten the resilience of real estate and its practice. So I want to ask you, as I go through this presentation, to relate my input to the particular sector of the real estate market that you are located in terms of geography, or that you are practicing in or studying in or maybe even regulating in. So we would be able to, work together from this general discussion to, really make use of the input into our respective practices. So traditionally, we want to start by understanding what resilience in real estate means. But if we start looking at definitions of resilience and all, I mean, we could take the whole of 30 minutes because there are so many definitions depending on who is doing the defining. But what I've tried to do is to curate a few that will relate to the essence of real estate and then to see what it is that is coming out across board. So there are, these definitions are actually sourced from online materials and review from academic sources as well. So we see definitions of resilience or conceptualization of resilience as the ability of a property or facility to adapt to and withstand extreme weathers and man-made disasters while maintaining its function and structure. Very general to what we understand about resilience in general in urban spaces, in cities and all. But when we now look at it in terms of investments, so what are resilient investments? These are investments that are able to withstand the effect of not only acute disruptions in the market, but also chronic longer-term threats. And then we look at assets, real estate assets. And I like this thought conceptualization because it sort of gets to the key of commercial real estate, so to say. So it defines resilient real estate as assets that are able to sustain tenant demand and support rents, underpinning capital values and ultimately returns for the investors. So this is the bottom line for investments, their ability, especially the real estate sector, the ability to sustain tenant demand, to make sure the property is occupied, whether as an asset or as asset-backed securities and all of that, to ensure that investors do not lose their funds. Then when we now look at the companies that are involved, the practices that are involved in managing real estate assets, it's also important that they are resilient. So when we're looking at companies and funds, we need them to survive and thrive in the face of social and environmental shocks and stresses. So we are not only looking at the real estate itself, we are also looking at the practitioners, the companies that are involved in the real estate sectors. So if we now look at the structure, we would be interested in the building, the commercial building, and the several businesses that they house, whether these businesses are into real estate or into commerce or into consultancy or other services. We also are interested in ensuring that the buildings that house these businesses adequately prepare for such events, shocks and stresses, and return to full operations, quickly return to full operations after shocks in particular. So what are these shocks and stresses that we are interested in and that we want the real estate sector to be resilient against? So we have climate change and natural disasters, fire outbreaks, floods, high winds, lightning, biodiversity habitat, earthquakes, hurricanes. We have man-made occurrences. We all know the pressure of manufacturing and the economic goals are threatening the climate significantly and is bringing up a whole lot of other natural disasters. Then health risks. I mean, everyone seated in this room experienced COVID-19, maybe in different ways, but the bottom line remains the same. Then macroeconomic conditions. Real estate is particularly vulnerable to changes in macroeconomic conditions. And of course, market conditions as well, the changes in demographics, changes in tenant preferences, changes in technology, and in some parts of the world, the dual real estate markets, the dual land markets, dual housing markets that also affect the ability of suppliers to put real estate into the market. Then there are a lot of other factors that are unknown and unpredictable, but which may just come up to be very important in the future. So all of these demand resilient actions. So I'll just quickly run through a few of these shocks and stresses. And I want to stress that the way we experience these occurrences as weather shocks and stresses actually depend on where we are and what is happening in our local areas. So, and I will elaborate more as we go on. So climate change and natural disasters have been frequent and more intense in the last few decades. And what happens is that when these occurrences, happen, they magnify challenges on already fragile systems. They also cause frequent and long-term disruptions in infrastructure, in transport and energy, and telecoms. For instance, urban flooding is a reality across several coastal cities globally now. So from Lagos to Mumbai to Jakarta, the reality is that climate change is bringing about increased flooding. And there are one or two studies that have even found that properties along the coast are prone to, have high vulnerability risk, and this affects their values in terms of, capital and rental. Also, of course, there is the thing that coastal cities are, actually also vulnerable to rising sea levels. And I dare say a city is only as good as its real estate. So COVID-19 is another, great shock that had monumental impact. But a lot of cities throughout the world had lockdowns for months on end, creating inaccessible spaces. So while we have our high-rise, we have our towers, we have our commercial spaces, they became inaccessible because of Can I please ask that we mute our audio so that we can all have an enriching experience? Okay, so I hope that mic is muted. Okay, thank you. So I was talking about inaccessible spaces. I mean, our offices were there and we just couldn't go there even if we wanted to do that. And we all started thinking about alternative working spaces, working from home, telecommuting, and rotating physical presences and all of that. While these alternative working spaces were in existence before COVID-19, COVID-19 actually accelerated the acceptance. And with that came the reconceptualization of shared spaces in offices. So office occupiers, renters, tenants started thinking about whether they actually need so much spaces to carry out their businesses. And we started seeing trends of workspace rationalization across cities. So, I mean, these could be termed as opportunities or threats, depending on where you are, depending on the kind of structure that is being managed. If it's easy to convert larger office spaces to smaller ones and let this out individually, perhaps those are opportunities and bring about flexibility. But if office spaces have been so designed as to be, really just as they are and not easy to change, then we could have threats of tenants actually pulling out of these offices and looking for smaller, more compact spaces and leaving large vacancies here and there. So market conditions also affects the real estate market. We have a new class called the eco boomers. These are younger people in their 20s, single people and people without children who are well suited to work from home, possibly because their sector is the tech sector or something they can easily work from home. So we start having demand for smaller luxury units depending on the income classes in that market. And we start to see trends towards maybe land purchases for those of us in economies where you have to buy your land to build amongst these classes. So according to a 2017 multifamily report, there was an oversupply of Class A luxury properties at one time across UST because they are too expensive for these markets. They just require somewhere to rent rather than to own. So real estate is vulnerable to that as well. We saw a similar pattern in Nigerian cities as well, where real estate developers started shifting post-pandemic, started shifting from large family housing construction to smaller, compact, highly equipped apartments suitable to working from home for the younger generation. Of course, microeconomic conditions, as we are seeing now, with increasing fossil fuel rates and all of that, high interest rates, high inflation rates, are leading to lower disposable income, which will then affect mortgage payments, we threaten travel and tourism, and we threaten profits of securities that are tied to these assets, and also the real estate investments. So all of these occurrences are so much more required that we think about resilience in the real estate sector. But I dare say that the bottom line is to mitigate the risk of wealth loss that could occur in real estate investment. So whether the investment is in securities or new build or existing buildings, as managers of real estate investment, as managers of properties, as regulators that also are looking at the bottom line for taxation and all, the bottom line is to mitigate the risk of wealth loss in the sector, so that whatever threatens occupancy rates, the capacity of tenants to pay, accessibility to the building for whatever reasons, threatens wealth and poses a risk and demands a resilient response. So, and this is also where resilience meets sustainability and sustainability meets resilience, because sustainability principles requires that we pay due attention to social, economic, and environmental concerns. And so that while we are thinking about resilient interventions for our properties, we need to carry this out responsibly. We need to carry this out with consideration for sustainable principles. And this places a significant challenge to real estate practitioners. So there's a whirlwind of volatility that spins us in the last few decades from one crisis to the other, from COVID-19 to the Russia-Ukraine war, to local, occurrences in our cities, in our countries, that it is now imperative that real estate business leaders look for new skills and strategies that will help their organizations, clients, and investment portfolios thrive in a new and rapidly changing global economy. So what are these specific challenges? We need to respond with agility. Agility is the currency for action in the resilience space. We need to respond with agility in an environment where we are dealing with a solid asset, a solid physical standing asset that will not go anywhere by just a flicker of our fingers. We are looking at real estate markets that are localized in nature, so that our responses have to relate with the situation on ground. We are looking at assets with multiple interests that there are so many stakeholders on. We are looking at agility in an environment of high heterogeneity. I mean, the residential submarket is different from the commercial submarket, it's different from industrial. Within each submarket, we have different interests and different property types and different requirements for real estate. We are looking at, for us in Africa, market information in the real estate sector is not always available. So we are looking at a space where we have to generate some market information even by ourselves as individuals or as companies. We are looking at a capital-intensive assets that require significant running costs to optimize. So these are the challenges that we face when we are looking at resilient intervention. So if we now even get back to this and we start to think about which intervention to invest in to support resilience, what mitigation interventions will provide the best return, what other opportunities for funding can be leveraged, remembering that bottom line, and remembering that resilient actions and interventions also have financial implications that have to be paid for. So there would be resistance for those that do not get that. There would be resistance to putting in capital into resilience interventions. But even that being the case, we then need to understand the resilient values of a wide range of stakeholders that are embedded in the assets that we are managing. We have the users of properties, we have the investors, we have property owners, we have government, we have civil society, and even the suppliers and contractors. We have neighbors and we have host communities. And we then have to package the resilient values of these stakeholders into a composite that will, address the social, economic, and environmental aspirations of these groups. Added to that layer is the fact that we have to be agile in the face of the macroeconomic environment that we do not even control to some extent. And the imperative is that asset resilience is not enough. The surrounding community must be resilient as well. Let's imagine the occurrence of, maybe a flood incident or something similar that leads to a roadblock just across from our properties or on the streets where the properties we are managing are in. So we could have put in all the efforts to have a resilient property, all the expenses to have a resilient property. But if these stakeholders do not have the same resilient value, if government is not up to speed with clearing the roads at a time of flooding or, maybe fire outbreak or something, our properties would no longer be resilient. If the neighboring properties, whether they are high-rises or residential, if the managers do not have a high resilience value, whatever happens in that neighborhood would affect our own resilient property. So this means that we have to think more locally around what is happening within our spaces while planning for resilience. And that is why my thinking as a transdisciplinary researcher is to, drill down to the collaborative pathways that we need to, recognize while planning for resilience. So from this chart that I obtained from the GWIRE website, I have modified a bit to allow us to start thinking about what pathways and who to the stakeholders that we need to work with at different stages of the resilient response that we are looking at. So in vulnerability assessment, we have to look at a portfolio risk assessment analysis, where we're looking at the physical, social, governance, macroeconomic, and transition risk. But we have to do that considering the needs, the history of the local spaces, as well as working with users, investors, property managers. We have to look at insurance providers. We have to look at local planning legislations. We have to look at environment and disaster records. So it's not something that you would sit in your office or put up 2 or 3 team members within your office space to think about. It has to be done collaboratively. If we then look at resilience planning, where we want to develop a resilience policy or strategy, and we are considering the site, we're considering the structure, the operations people, and neighborhood, we still have to work with a larger, the stakeholder group. We need to work with local emergency offices, whether it's fire or hurricane, or, we have to work with the building staff. We have to look at service providers. We have to look at insurance sector to see what can be funded and what cannot. We have to work with local associations of property owners or managers if they exist. And we have to work with civil society and those communities for those of us that, manage real estate in situations where we have indigenous communities and, and all of that. So all of these people have to be involved in resilience planning for our own property. Then when it comes to implementing strategies, I mean, before all of this, we need to start thinking about having done the strategy to now embed it into our property and our property management processes, or investment management processes, or portfolio management processes. We may need to redesign, we need to prepare, we need to get insured where possible, we need to raise awareness and communicate and hold drills, just like we do for fire, emergencies. We need to hold drills to ensure that we actually communicate the resilience strategy. It is not at the point of an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane that we start thinking about what to do. That must be ingrained. So, and all of these have to be done collaboratively. And there are some lessons that we can learn from. While I'm just going to talk about two that I have personally been involved in as a consultant, and that is the Rockefeller's Foundation's 100 Resilience City. So while this is a city scale intervention, it actually places, governments in the realm of response, anticipating and responding to, shocks and stresses within the city. So I've seen a lot of criticisms, and all about the 100 RC project being not successful and all of that. But as someone who was involved in, developing the resilience strategy for Lagos, and also was then worked further with a chief resilience officer in place, I guess it's been useful to have governments think about this. And it's useful also because it's also asks for collaboration in setting up the resilience strategies and, bringing up initiatives that are actionable, that can be supported by partners from the private, public, and NGO sectors. With that basis, those of us in the real estate sector can then, look at the bigger picture and see where our own holdings fit into. So here is just a list of cities that are, within the 100 RC framework, globally. I mean, it could be useful to see in your own city what is happening to that. Each of these cities has a chief resilience officer and has a resilience office. And also what it does is for us to also start thinking about who to anchor resilience strategies within our real estate sector, within our real estate holdings that we are managing. And then there is the UN Habitat City Resilience Action Planning tool, which also puts, the responsibility, or puts local governments into action in thinking about resilience. Not just local government, but business owners and also communities. So in the work that I've done previously, we were able to use the City Resilience Action Planning tool to work alongside a low-income, informal, vulnerable community in Lagos. And working with the citizen science approach, we were able to work with the women in the community, virtually, I should add, because we did this during COVID. We're able to train them, we're able to, support them in identifying the shocks and stresses that affect their community and bringing out initiatives to address them. And because we're also, we had the Lagos Resilience Office, we're able to bring in the government to support. And as I speak, out of the 15 initiatives that were identified by the community, the government has been able to address about 9 of them, which is really significant because in many cases, these communities like this, just go silent and unheard of, in the normal scheme of things. So what does that mean for us as real estate practitioners? So I'll just like to conclude with a few quotes. Traditional risk management often relied on diversification and insurance to control risk, but some long-term threats may not be insurable and may be non-diversifiable. So much of the work to create real estate portfolios must be at the asset level. So we come down to the asset, we create properties that can withstand long-term changes through their design and also through, their value to the, surrounding or to the local real estate that they are, situated in. So that is one perspective, something we need to think about. Then we also need to think about collaboratively identifying measures to reduce risk while increasing resilience. We want to undertake actions that are deemed to be cost effective. Remember the bottom line. And then we need to communicate such actions to tenants, prospective tenants, and other stakeholders, bearing in mind that shocks would happen without us, being prepared, so to say, if we don't take these measures. Then we can help as, an industry, commercial building owners and managers serve their communities while also providing value to their occupants and the environment. So in the last analysis, my message would be that we should think about responsible, resilient interventions. So we should look at strategies that will benefit not only the properties that we are managing or the portfolios that we are in charge of. We must also think about how to do this collaboratively, how to ensure that resilient actions do not undermine sustainable principles. I think that calls for a lot of changes in the way we work and the way we conceptualize real estate. And having a local focus will also help significantly to achieve this. So I think I will stop here for now and see if there are questions that can be attended to. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Basirat. Really appreciate all the thoughts that you gave to us today. Lots to think about on this big topic. So I'll start off with a question or two that I had while I'm waiting for more questions to be added in the chat. But one thing that sort of struck me as you went through your presentation is the need for individual action, that all these property managers, all these investors, they have the imperative to, take action against possible effects of a lot of these negative events possibly happening. So do you think that individual action is enough? Or do you think there's a bigger role for regulation at the country level, the city level? What do you think the balance is?
Well, so when we talk about this, we need to start thinking about who should drive resilience. In the bigger sustainability space, we have reluctance of property developers. Maybe in some cities, in my city, I know that it's very slow in uptake. I mean, sustainability principles in, green buildings and all. But when we talk about resilience, we're talking about a different ball game. So it is who stands to lose the most from not being prepared for shocks and stresses. So if as real estate practitioners, we take a breath and look at that, we can then start taking actions towards ensuring that the resilience value of that group or that stakeholder is increased, because it affects our reputation as well. So if we're taking individual actions on this property, we also need to take a step towards ensuring that surrounding properties are also resilient. And how can that be done? I don't think that just going and knocking on the other door and say, oh, your property has to be resilient. I don't think that will work. But if there is regulation that requires certain level of compliance without being draconic, that is realistic and done in a collaborative way, then we can shift, the situation towards having higher uptake of resilience planning and investing in resilient interventions.
Thank you so much. We've had a few questions come into the chat. Let's see here. Let's see. One question from Esther is that, how can we include resilience strategies in our overall practice? What are some practical suggestions, perhaps, that you could offer us?
Okay, so as if we look at each property class demands its own resilient action, and which is why I say much of what we're going to do after now is localized. So what are the shocks and stresses that affect your property holdings in your local area? So in a city like Lagos, so we are not prone to earthquakes. So for now, we're not liable to thinking about that as a shock, but we are very vulnerable to flooding. So what kind of actions should we do to protect the sea line and to protect properties that are there? So it could be as simple or maybe as complex as wider drainages, ensuring that waste is disposed properly. And I think this cuts across a lot of African, cities. We need to have better drainage systems. We need to have citywide drainage systems. If we're looking at the issue of power cuts, for instance, when a few weeks ago we learned of severe power cuts in South Africa, and we know that caused a lot of, it could be a shock in that space if, you're not used to it. But in other parts of the world where, power outage is an everyday thing, alternative systems of power generation are being used. So you need to think about it. Do you need to maybe have isolated power or alternative power supply off the grid? How can that be done sustainably? So the actions that we'll be taking will depend on the local situation, the local shocks and stresses, and the property classes that one is managing. But it's important as a company, as a real estate company, to have a resilient strategic outlook for the properties that one is managing. And this is often overlooked. So it's important to have that, as a corporate profile.
I think that's a great takeaway, that the right time to think about resilience is before you need it, not, there's not much you can do after the fact.
No. After the fact, you're just a victim.
Exactly.
But before you have the leeway to take some action.
So sort of a follow-on question to that from Karen, can you suggest some cities or some companies that are leaders or innovators in this area? What are some of the success stories, particularly as you were part of the group that led this effort for your city? Can you point us to some examples that practitioners or researchers who are interested in how this is integrated can look to learn from?
Okay, so they're quite, but from what I found, these companies are to be found mostly in the US and and other parts of the developed world, and they operate in a significantly different environment than other parts of the world, which was why I refrained from being highly categorical, because I wanted every practice here to think about this as it relates to their scenarios. But then the strategy, the 100 RC is a case in point that I can very well say it's helped to structure thinking towards resilience. And although there was funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and several cities applied, and only a few were, shortlisted and then supported to have resilience strategies, but it's something that can be looked up, particularly if you are in this space to study methodologies for collaborative actions and all the 100 resilience strategy. I mean, and most of the reports, virtually all of the reports are online as well. I could share links. In terms of companies taking the lead, there are quite a few that have, put in these systems into their organizations and trying to rationalize spaces and see what kind of spaces are best used for, our priorities for their consumers and bringing this into the strategy. So, I mean, these are examples that could be useful for others, but I would also stress looking at our local environment so that we don't just bring in things that won't work in our own particular spaces.
So, sort of tying some of these questions together, you spoke a lot about the asset level, what individual property owners perhaps should consider in this pathway to resilience. But thinking at a more macro level, what can a city do to make itself more resilient? What are some actions that can be taken at a city level that can make a priority for future sustainable development? Of course, we have to worry about the buildings that we already have, but going forward, how can we make sure that new construction, new development is sustainable and resilient?
So the first thing is to recognize the vulnerabilities of the city. I mean, the particular shocks and stresses that are existing and are likely to, also, especially the stresses, our stresses are occurrences that, are insidious. They are there, they happen, and they undermine the capacity of the city to respond to bigger shocks. So, for instance, traffic, it affects the health, it affects emissions, it affects a lot of other environmental issues. So each city has to define their own vulnerabilities, and definition must be done from a bottom-up perspective, because the city is made up of different components, and this process must be inclusive so that the vulnerability of one group, is not taken advantage of to solve the problem of another group. So as much as possible, collaborative actions are needed at the city level to first understand what the city is vulnerable to. But there are other things that are general, for instance, funding resilience. I did say that it all boils down to the financials. Somebody has to pay for resilient interventions. So, and the insurance sector is looked at as one of the low-hanging fruits. So how developed is the insurance sector in each city to actually support building back better, So, and I know that I think for Cape Town, there's this initiative of supporting the insurance sector to insure other types of risk so that people have access to funding to, build back better after events. And also there's lobbying for the government budget to be more flexible to shocks and stresses, to ensure that the money is released or funds are released to appropriate sectors to respond when shocks and stresses occur. So, I mean, those are actions at the city level that can be taken. Of course, the governance is also important. Advocacy, is important to ensure that government takes this action. And so, and of course, having a network also of cities that are already doing something in this space also helps a lot. So,
I think you made an important point there in your Cape Town example with the role that the insurance market might play, and how we might need to support the insurance market, because there may someday be some risk that these insurances companies say, we're just not going to touch. It's just too big. We can't diversify. We can't charge you a high enough premium to make this worth it. So definitely collaboration with that industry, I think is key. Let's see, we've had another question or two come in. So in considering members of our community that might be worse affected by these shocks, and in context of need of resilience, how can partnership as a sustainability principle help in resilience management? What are some of the partnerships that we should be looking to form?
Okay, so when we're talking about partnerships, we also need to ensure that we are talking about equitable partnerships. You understand? So, for instance, there is a lot in the space of public-private partnerships that could be, deployed, where the government brings in the regulatory, so to say, aspects and supports the private sector, that will bring in the funding and the risk management expertise to address specific problems in urban areas. But in many cases, we find that the community is often forgotten in these spaces. So there's the big P of the public sector, the government, and there's the big P of the private sector. And caught in between these two interests are the vulnerable members of the community that do not have voices. So as far as I'm concerned, as a researcher and as an advocate, these PPPs are not working unless we have the community on that table as well. And this is the space where academics and the civil society groups have significant values in identifying these discrepancies and bringing to light the need and the strategies to involve communities. And this is also where the local conceptualization of resilience, action, and management is important. And this also requires a systems approach. So there are a lot of paradoxes here and there, but a systems approach is required to ensure that every group is brought on board as much as possible, meaningfully, not at the end where decisions have already been made. So as for those of us that are academics, we start to see the need for transdisciplinary approaches in addressing these issues, to ensure that we bring in the government, the private sector, the communities, advocates together into one room to outline actions that are needed at the planning stage, at the implementation stage, and strategy development stage. So these are just some of the approaches, and there is a lot in that space as terms of toolkits and recommendations for our partnerships.
Thank you. A question from Elaine. So at the beginning of our time together, Francois mentioned that S, the social component, and ESG is important, but it's not getting as much attention as it should. So do you have any suggestions on how we bring the S and ESG to the forefront and make sure that our real estate assets are spaces that are more hospitable and more and are places that we want to live?
Yeah, so the social is still boils down to this group of often forgotten should I say segment of the society. It's the social has to do with social justice, with equity, with recognition, with giving the voice. And what is the challenge is who wants to be, because this is not a space that is easy to navigate. So it needs a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of time to gain trust. So depending on where you are, there is a need to actually gain the trust of whatever actors are in that space. And like I said, there are lots of stakeholders. And you also have to look at the cost of not paying attention to this group. So, I mean, a few organizations, specialize in looking at the social costs and economic benefits of resilient interventions. We need to do more of that. If we want to bring the S out, we need to speak out for it. We need to show the importance. We need to show the costs of not bringing the S in, and the benefits of bringing them in. So there is a need for, looking at the business case for bringing the S in. And there's been a lot of responses, even within the consumer group, wanting more sustainable properties, wanting better properties that fit the social context, and essentially just wanting to have the opportunity to impact positively. So these positive energies we need to tap into. As a matter of fact, the real estate sector is really focused on the economic aspect because it's all about returns on investments. We need to protect. I mean, all of this is not to say we should not protect investment, we should not make profits. We need to make profits for the investors. I mean, that is what makes the world go round, but we need to be responsible about this. We just need to put out the S and make a business case for it and support those whose work is full-time into making business cases for social issues. So, and this is where the working together comes into play.
Wonderful. And from that, I'll draw out that one bit that you said, that this is really an opportunity. So it sounds like this is a great space for researchers to make really valuable contributions in the next year. So we should view it as an opportunity, not just, oh, that's something we don't know enough about. It's a chance for us to make an impact in this area.
Yeah.
I think we may have time for one more question, but I think I have asked all that are in the chat, so I will maybe take the last question here, and just to kind of tie in with the breakout groups that we're going to move into in just a minute. What are some areas or some ideas that you think would be fruitful for research in the upcoming years around this topic? We're all experts in different areas of real estate, but this is something that kind of transcends all topics. So what would you suggest would be maybe some ideas that we should look at?
Okay, so thanks for that question. And it's important because, like you said, Megan, resilience calls for actions across all spaces. It's not just for property managers, it cuts across. So there is, if you are an ardent researcher, it is exciting time to be in the real estate research space. And some of the things that came to mind as I prepared that for this presentation, which is interesting for me and maybe could be interesting for others, is to look at a broad range of issues. So if we're looking at resilience from the perspective of office spaces, we could carry out studies that looks at how we could redesign spaces in such a way that we recognize the spaces that are important for users to be in at every point in time. Also bearing in mind the changing environment for work now that we have people working in an organization. We could have people working physically full-time, people working virtually full-time, people, moving between physical and virtual some days of the week. So how can we design office spaces to optimize these needs. So I saw an interesting article which says that we should reconceptualize the use of the wall. So the wall that divides our office spaces is not just a structural element anymore. It's become the screen, for communication. So how should we place walls within buildings to optimize, that is just one. Then how can we create real estate as an adaptive system to support organization strategy, brand, and culture? How can we design in such a way that, each structure is fluid while it remains economically viable and it remains safe and it, satisfies the need that it is required to be put into. So if, as a student, as a researcher, you are interested in establishing the cost of climate change, we can look at this perspective from the local market. We can establish sales differential between similar categories of properties that are resilient and not resilient. We can establish the financial implication of not being resilient per case study, or if there's access to significant huge databases, we can use databases to establish this, and also look at local adaptive capacity. And then there's something that I've seen in definitions of resilience that when I reflected on, it got me like, oh my God. So when we see definitions that say, oh, resilience is being able to bounce back after a shock or stress. So I start asking myself, does it really work that way? Can you actually bounce? I mean, between the origin and the landing and the back flipping to bouncing, a lot of things happen within that space. So what is the time between when a shock affects, or a real estate, and the real estate is able, the operations of the use is able to go back to scale? What is the time frame? What are the resources required? What are the inputs required? What is the cost of bouncing back? Then, do we really want to bounce back, or do we want to move forward? So, I mean, these are the kind of questions that could be answered across different aspects of real estate studies or practices. Then the one that I mentioned about understanding the resilience values or the resilience aspirations of the various stakeholders that bind the real estate sector together. How do we package this into a composite product? How do we recognize losers and gainers, and how can we mitigate, actions to ensure that as much as possible there are, the gainer, as much as possible, we don't gain resilience at the cost of sustainability. So there's a lot here. We can also talk about how fund managers can manage the resilience value of various stakeholder groups in their portfolio, and of course, how to listen to these values and the subjectiveness of it. If we now go to the particular issues that are faced in different cities around the world, for instance, in developing countries in Africa, cities where we have so many dichotomies in the property sector. So we want to look at how informality, for instance, affects resilience planning or the choice of resilience interventions. We want to look at how informal markets and dual markets also affects the choice of the property to invest in the first place, and the resilient actions that are, required to be taken. We can also look at the barriers to real estate resilience in every sector, in every city that you can think of. I'm sure that if it does, even just a general question of what are the barriers to resilient real estate in your city or in your sector, we bring up so many different answers and interesting, inputs that we can all benefit from. So maybe I should stop here for now.
So many ideas for us to think of. So really appreciate all of your knowledge that you shared with us today. And thank you so much for being our featured speaker today.
Thank you.
So for those, I've had a few people ask, we will be making a video link of this presentation available to everyone a few days after the event. So you'll receive that link via email. So now I see a couple more questions actually came in at the end. So I'm going to ask Basirat to stick here in the main room. If you want to talk with her one-on-one, and ask any more questions, please feel free to do so. But I'm going to also now open up the breakout rooms so you can talk in small groups about some of these things that we've discussed today among people who share your research interests. And feel free to stay in these rooms as long as you want. We won't gather back together as a full group. So if you want to change groups or join a different one, that is fine. I'm going to go ahead and open those up. And before I do so, just thanks again to everyone who helped organize this event, our committee members, and of course, the biggest thank you to Basirat for sharing her presentation with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And if you could bear with me for just a moment while I create these rooms. I had created them last night, but they seem to have been erased. So if you want to just stick here for 1 second, I will open them up shortly.
If my microphone is working, I'll also remind everyone to join in the future when our Global Women in Real Estate group has additional activities in the next year. You'll be receiving a survey after this event about what you liked, what you'd like to see in the next events, and whether you'd like to work on the committees that put these sort of programs together. So thank you, especially to our speakers and all of our committee members. Thank you so much for the work you're doing for the International Real Estate Society. And if you don't have an active women's group within your sister society, consider at least putting on some events at your sister society's conferences to help young women, especially as they're working their way through their research and professional careers, so that we can all help everyone succeed in the real estate field as women.
Thank you so much. And if you'll just hang with me for 1 more second, I will open up these rooms here. And yes, we really appreciate any feedback you give us on the event and topics that you'd like to see in the future. All right, without any further ado, you should be able to see our different breakout rooms. And I hope that you enjoy the discussions with some of your fellow researchers and academics.
I'm not so okay. I was Zoom.
Well, while we're waiting, Basirat, I'll ask you a question. What are you currently working on for your research? What is the current topic that you are working on?
Okay, so right now, I manage which I neglected to say, I manage the Center for Housing and Sustainable Development at the University of Lagos, and we have a network of about 10 African universities, the African Research Network for Urbanization and Habitable Cities. And this year we're focusing on resilience in urban Africa. And what I'm doing right now at the University of Lagos with my research group is to look at the possibility of working with the insurance sector or even the financial sector to develop new products for resilience intervention at the community level. So we've been interacting with community development associations. They are local, associations that support infrastructure and livability at the community level. So that's what I'm doing right now. But my other activities in the resilience space is now to put up all the studies on resilience that we are working on as a network into a publication or policy documents and all for our respective cities. So it's emerging because we've only completed the studies, small scale studies with stakeholder groups. So we're putting all the reports together into a single format and then to make it public. So that's what I'm doing now. Maybe you need to just
Are you presenting on this topic at the African Real Estate Society meeting? Right?
No. No, not at least not this year. So because we're still working, we're still developing. Although one could present on methodologies, but for now the outcome is not yet defined, so to say, to share.
For those of you who haven't picked a group yet, I really encourage you to join the new data and methods group that's being led by Yi Wu. And I know she'd love to have some more people join her, as well as Andressa is leading the real estate contract management, which I think from a legal sense is very interesting in how we're actually going to regulate resiliency. So if you're still looking for a group, please, I'd encourage you to join either one of those. Not to interrupt the wonderful discussion going on here. Just wanted to make sure you're all aware.
Yeah, I think it's important because some may have joined, and they're not aware they have to go join the breakout room. So it's good to put that.
Yes, if they don't see it at the bottom of the screen where choices are for reactions and that kind of thing, there's one for breakout rooms. If you click on that, you'll see the choices.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to go around and check out the different groups. You guys are all welcome to stay here or join a group of your own. But in case I don't see you again, Basirat, thank you so much. I hope that in the future we can meet in person at a conference someday.
Yes.